This month, we're bringing you some of our favorite Bookmark episodes recorded over the years with our good friend, Father Benedict Groeschel. We hope you enjoy the following interview from our Bookmark archives. And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, with a very special author and guest, Father Benedict Groeschel. This time we're speaking about his work, A Still Small Voice, published by Ignatius Press. Welcome, Father Groeschel. Always a pleasure to have you here in person. Obviously, it's wonderful every Sunday for our audience to be able to visit with you on our Sunday night with Father Benedict Groeschel show, but it's great always to get an opportunity to talk to you about one of your other avocations, writing. And now this book is a book from the past. This book is about 14 or 15 years old, but I always thought it was a classic, A Still Small Voice. What's it about?
It's about private revelations and what the church teaches us about how to deal with a private revelation. It by no means is against private revelations. Certain private revelations are very significant in my own life. Right. The Sacred Heart, the visions at Lourdes, at Fatima, for instance, just to name a couple. But as you know, there are endless reports of private revelations, and people don't know that the church has some teaching on this, about what you should do.
And how things are evaluated.
How things are evaluated. And what a person should do if they hear of a new report of private revelations, how they should behave, or if they believe they have received
themselves,
one.
Actually,
yes.
Right. Okay.
And how do they get approved initially? What's universal approval? Is there ever an infallible statement on private revelations? So there's a whole lot of questions, and the book is still very popular,
right? Because
every once in a while a bishop is confronted with a report of a private revelation, and the first thing will happen, I'll get an order for 20 copies.
So you know what's actually going on around the country, revelation-wise.
The Vicar General calls me up and he said me 25 copies of that book.
You know something's going on. Now, just before we go further, I saw a name in here I recognize. I see a John Lynch, and I see a familiar kind of style of artwork on the cover that is graced many of your other books, Stumbling Blocks and Stepping Stones, etc. Now, there's a Father John Lynch who works with you on your show. Is that the same person?
That's the same person. Okay. Father John Lynch was a college student at that time, or a seminary student, and he's now pastor in Ellenville, New York. No time to do any more artwork, that's for sure.
Right. Now, you say in the introduction originally to this book, you said, this is a bit of enlightened self-interest on my part doing this book. I need something to save time when serious people earnestly, almost desperately ask questions about what is happening to them and their friends. Candidly, I need to be able to hand someone a book. While not a comprehensive study of private revelation, this book will be, I hope, a helpful guide to the devout, the responsible, and even the merely curious. Now, have you found that to have been a success that way?
Yes, it certainly is. What the book is a simplification and modernization of a great classical book. It's 100 years old, called The Graces of Interior Prayer by Augustin Poulain, a very, very learned and wise Jesuit. And
well, Mitch would be happy to hear you quoting that, right?
And we simplify it, and I think I'm faithful to Poulain. I'm happy to say another Jesuit told me he likes the book very much, and that's Cardinal Avery Dulles. He told me he thought it was a good book.
So we're in some good company in talking about this book. Now, you write here in the beginning, an appreciation of and sensitivity to ordinary religious experience frees a person from the possibility of serious error and spiritual pride.
Yes, because hopefully the vast majority of religious people have some spiritual experiences. They feel close to God, or they feel the absence of God, which is the dark experience. And sometimes God seems very close. But to the wrong person, in the sense of an imaginative person, or perhaps a somewhat flighty person, all of a sudden they can interpret that as a private revelation. And indeed, having listened to and read many reports of supposed private revelation, I think that's exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. You also say the monotony of sacrifice, fidelity, and generosity may be the safest and most productive of all religious experience, and it is there waiting for all of us.
Well, of course, there we have the marvelous quotation from Saint Therese of Lisieux. Mm-hmm. Somebody wanted to bring her to Lourdes, and she said, "To ecstasy, I prefer the monotony of sacrifice." Now, I happen to be a great enthusiast for Lourdes, and that marvelous little soul, Bernadette. I only wish I had known Bernadette. When I woke up after my accident and I found out I couldn't move and they told me what happened, the first thing I did is I said, "I'm putting this whole thing into the hands of Bernadette." And here I am, you know, Bernadette's been doing her job up there.
Right. And I know you talk about her later in the book because you like her so much, and you even juxtapose kind of like Therese's experience and Bernadette's experience and why they're different.
Bernadette was a simple little peasant girl, and she was the perfect witness. She said what happened. She never added a syllable. She would not even initially say that she had seen the Blessed Virgin. She said, "I saw a lady who said she was the Immaculate Conception." Well, I said, "That's the Blessed Virgin." "I saw a lady who said she was the Immaculate." So Bernadette was really a very wise little peasant girl. Mm-hmm. She was a little fresh, too, you know. Bernadette wasn't anything like Jennifer Jones in the Song of Bernadette. Okay. Not at all. Bernadette could almost be a little snippy. The Monsignor who said to her, "Do you expect me to believe the Blessed Virgin appeared to you?" She said, "No, Monsignor, I don't expect you to believe it. It's not my job to make you believe it. It's my job to tell you what she said." Thank you, Bernadette. Mm-hmm. Now, Therese did not have these things. Therese had the monotony of sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful autobiography that emerges from the writings of Saint Therese shows that what she experienced at sometimes was darkness and the absence of God. Mm-hmm. Therese says shortly before her death, "I cannot say that I believe, but that I choose to believe."
Mm-hmm. Well, in describing those two things, for the average person who's out there who, you know, is interested in their Catholic faith and their spirituality, isn't it more exciting to be connected to the kind of visions that, like, Bernadette kind of has?
If they're real.
Right. But isn't that the attraction for those
yes,
people? Because you talk about one of the issues about people being too curious.
Yes. And many spiritual writers warn people about that. You see, one of the reasons for the popularity of reports of private revelations is that some scholars have undermined the credibility of the Gospels and the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Jesus didn't do this, Jesus didn't do that. To which I say, were you there? But some people hearing this look for a fifth gospel. Mm-hmm. They look for a direct revelation of God. They're unaware of the fact that the Pope says, Pope Benedict XIV, that in no private revelation can you place faith. Mm-hmm. All you can do is place positive, prudent opinion. And he criticizes three mystics, canonized mystics, mm-hmm. and says that some of their reported revelations have error in them. Mm-hmm. St. Catherine of Siena, St. Hildegard of Bingen, and
well, I know there's
St. Bridget of Sweden.
Sweden, right.
Yes.
Okay.
No, they're all saints. Catherine of Siena is a doctor of the church.
Right.
But she said the Blessed Virgin revealed to her that she was not immaculately conceived. Mm-hmm. Wow. Mm-hmm. That's worthwhile knowing if you like private revelations.
Right.
And people say, well, how could that be?
Right.
Because the person getting the revelation is subject to error especially if it's a true revelation, because then it is an infinite being touching the mind of a finite being. A private revelation isn't a conversation between two people. It may seem to the visionary like that, like the children of Fatima. They were talking to the lady.
Right.
But that lady is from eternity. Those little children were smart enough to realize there was something different because they could see the trees behind the lady through her figure. They knew that they were not having an ordinary perception. Then with Fatima, you have the private revelation backed up by what's called a theophany, which is a public manifestation of divine power. And the theophany of Fatima in 1917, where tens of thousands of people saw the whirling sun, where the anti-religious secular newspapers of Lisbon reported it the following Sunday.
Right.
The reporters were there. They took pictures. That's a theophany. That's not a private revelation. Everybody sees that.
Right.
That's the top of the line. This is what we read about with Moses.
But that doesn't occur that often, right?
No, the transfiguration in the gospel appears to be a theophany.
Well, as you mentioned just before, to play off that, St. Catherine Laboure, who gave the world a miraculous medal, actually predicted the bloody disturbances of the French Commune 40 years before they occurred, and with the precise date. However, she made several other predictions that were wrong. And it says here that she said, you know, basically the idea, when confronted with these errors, she simply apologized for getting the facts of the revelation wrong. She obviously did not know what to say, since she thought she had got the message right. Which is what you're saying,
and
right?
Catherine Laboure was a simple soul. God usually chooses very simple souls for his sake. And Catherine Laboure said, I got it wrong. So there's the essence. A private revelation, even to a canonized saint, according to Pope Benedict the 14th, can contain error.
Now, you also say, because a visionary may have erred in the report of revelation, as you say, one cannot conclude that this person has not received a special grace. You also say, it is also true that if visionaries proclaim prophecy which turns out to be correct, one cannot by that fact alone assume that they received the revelation from God. They may, in fact, have gained the knowledge in some other way.
Some other way. Well, most of us can predict that tomorrow morning we're going to eat breakfast. I mean, life is filled with obvious predictions. Predictions of an unusual event that does occur. That's certainly worthy of very real attention. Part of my point in writing this is that people go from one extreme to the other. Either they absolutely don't accept private revelation. We've got a couple of people teaching theology in the United States right now, particularly one of them at Notre Dame. He dismisses all this, you know, dismiss the stigmata of Padre Pio. I don't think he's ever seen a stigmata. I've seen 5 of them. I don't think any of the 5 I saw were miraculous. But in 4 cases, they were authentic.
What's the difference between miraculous and authentic?
Authentic is that the person did not culpably deceive by making the wounds.
Okay.
They occurred, and they look very much like blood blisters, and the person's a devout person, and this phenomena in psychology called symbolic wounds can occur. Now, if you take something like Padre Pio, you had open wounds for 50 years, which openly bled and never infected. But even in the case of Padre Pio, and I think his stigmata was miraculous, he was not canonized because of the miraculous. My friend, Pastor Bernard Ruffin, in his excellent biography of Padre Pio.
He's been on the show before.
Yes, Padre Pio, The True Story. He says that Padre Pio is a saint because of how he dealt with these phenomena. He didn't go looking for publicity. He wasn't getting public relations.
And you talk about that as being one of the signs of a true visionary or a true revelation. In a
If
sense,
I
right?
hear of any visionary, a supposed visionary, seeking publicity, I flee. It's a fact that no private revelation given to an adult in the last 300 years was accepted by the church if the identity of the visionary was known at the time of their death. Children or teenagers, yes, like Bernadette, the other visionaries that were not teenagers, Catherine Laboure, Margaret Mary of the Sacred Heart, their identity was not known at the time of their death.
Okay.
People that break into the headlines, I simply flee. Children, because of their naivete, the children of Fatima, Bernadette, people like, they told people.
Well, another distinction you made here that I thought related to what you said earlier about innocence with Catherine Laboure, telling what they thought it was, is a distinction you make between false revelations and fraudulent revelations.
Yes.
Why don't you go
A
into
false revelation is one that the visionary really thinks is authentic. And I get these in the mail all the time. People that I don't think had a revelation, but they think they had a revelation, and they're sincere. As a result of writing this book, I get tons of private revelation in the mail.
People want to see if it passes muster with you.
And it doesn't. Okay. They're usually disappointed. On the other hand, a fraudulent revelation would be one where the person is purposely deceiving people.
Consciously.
Yeah, it's
attempting
a
to
lie.
deceive people. Right.
It's a jip.
And you talk about a couple going back to scriptural days with Simon Magus and on through who the Franciscan nun Magdalena of the Cross.
Oh, Magdalena. There's what you should hear about. St. John of the Cross, the great mystic doctor, was very, very, very low on private revelations. He said, when there's a report of a private revelation, you should assume it is the work of the devil until the opposite can be proved. That's a tough position. But he lived at the time of this nun, Magdalena of the Cross, who had the stigmata and who floated in the air in front of people. And she advised princes and kings and bishops. When the Spanish Armada came through the Straits of Gibraltar, she blessed it. They took her out of the cliff. And it promptly sank.
Yeah, I was going to say, it was defeated in the English Channel.
Yeah, so they got suspicious. And then she became deathly ill, and she admitted that as a young woman, before she was a nun, she had sold her soul to the devil in return for these apparent gifts. So careful.
Right.
If you like private revelation, be careful, because you are obliged to be careful by the first commandment. Otherwise, you can be involved in false worship and the violation of the first commandment.
Well, you say it is also worth noting that just because one believes that a revelation is from God, one is not thereby dispensed from following legitimate ecclesiastical authority. Revelations do not make or dispense from church laws. A revelation that did so would be certainly suspect.
Yes. Now, there's a complication there, is that the first decision on this is the local bishop. And most bishops live in mortal terror that somebody's going to have a private revelation in their diocese, because they'll never have a peaceful moment. Most bishops are praying that the Blessed Mother does not show up in their diocese. Now, when the bishop has to make a decision, a prudential decision, he gets help, he gets advice, and he makes the decision, and suppose he makes it in favor of the revelation. There's a couple of those around right now. And the identity of the person was an adult is known. That is not the final answer.
Okay.
Eventually, eventually it will go to Rome and to the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. There's a very popular private revelation around called The Poem of the God-Man by Maria Valtorta. Cardinal Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict, called this book a lump of theological absurdities. And he had it on the index. And when the index was done away with, he reminded people the next day that the book was still very much under suspicion.
Well, it says, in the use of the poem of the man god, it's also important to recall that Maria Valtorta is described in the preface as having spent the last decade of her life in a state similar to catatonic schizophrenia.
Yes, her publishers admit that. I think she was a very devout woman with considerable literary ability, and I think these started as her meditations. But what shows you, there are heretical things in the poem of the God-Man. For instance, the Blessed Virgin Mary being mad at the human race for the death of Christ. Please, you know.
Well, speaking of the Blessed Mother, you talk about here about even in the Pauline book, he talks about there's Maria of Agreda, Anne Catherine Emmerich, who obviously is popularized because of the Passion of the Christ, St. Elizabeth as well. Schonau. And they talking about their reports and their writings of the death of the Blessed Virgin Mary vary immensely. You know, there's various 14 years after the death, 21 years, 13 years, and as you point out, where he points out, they can't all be right.
Can't all be right, no. And probably the best thing to do is to leave them in question. One of the great visionaries was St. Francis of Rome, a nun in Rome. And after she died, the sister who took over the community as the superior said, Reverend Mother had a very busy imagination, something to that fact. You know, these are prayerful people, and their meditations begin to take on 3 dimensions that may not even be mental illness. If you read some of the great poets of the human race, they're terribly convincing. Or some of the popular symbolic novels of our time, Narnia and things like that.
C.S. Lewis,
you know, these people aren't presenting them as private revelations, but they certainly are convincing that in some domain of their mind, these things were happening. They're not mentally ill. They know they did not happen.
You say those interested in private revelations would do well to ponder this strange fact. To talk about Joan of Arc. Joan understood enough to change the history of Europe, but she did not understand her own destiny. You say many a private revelation or inspiration has saved a life, and you talk about a Brother Brendan.
Oh, Brother Brendan, as a friar minor, was a missionary in China when the Japanese invaded that part of China, and they came in one end of the city, and they went out, the friars and people with them went out the other side because they would kill any foreigners they found, lest they testify against them. So Brother Brendan was with an old friar, and they ran up into the hills, and they came to a crossroad. And they started one way, and an old man, not a Chinese, in biblical clothes, was standing there. He said, "No, go the other way." And they turned around and they ran the other way, and they heard the machine gun fire behind them. And Brother Brendan was absolutely convinced that it was St. Joseph. And Brother Brendan was as sane a person as I ever met in my life. So this can happen to a person. I have talked to people who had extraordinary experiences. They're not publicizing them. They're not calling the bishop to make a shrine. But it was something very, very powerful intervention of God in their life. And some of these people were unbelievers when it happened.
Now, going back to Bernadette, this was one I had heard you mention before. You talk about that when a revelation receives wide notoriety, there is likely to be a spate of reports of other visions. No less than 200 apparitions were reported in the vicinity of Lourdes after the experience of Bernadette. None of these were ever taken seriously. So that is the thing, when something does happen, that even if that's true, many times there are these kind of copycat experiences.
And most people have no idea that there were copycats all over the place at Lourdes. Some of them rather interesting. Some of them may indeed have had a validity.
Okay.
Some of them were silly. The thing about St. Joan, that's very interesting. Joan of Arc, the basis of seeing the two saints and the angel, magnificently painted in the Metropolitan Museum of Art by Bastien Lepage, a marvelous painting. He did a terrific job. Joan led the armies of France, a peasant girl who couldn't ride a horse, changed the history of Europe, changed the history of the Catholic Church, because France would have become part of England, and England left the Catholic Church at the Reformation. So we'd have no Saint Therese, no Saint John Vianney, no Sacred Heart, no nothing. And yet, when Joan was on trial, one of the friendly inquisitors said to her, "What do your voices tell you?" And she says, "St. Margaret told me, do not be afraid of your martyrdom. You will have a great victory." And he said, "What did she mean by your martyrdom?" She said, "What I have suffered already." And Joan went into the marketplace thinking she would be free.
And she wasn't.
And she did not lose hope. The canonization of Joan of Arc hangs on the 30 seconds when she's there at the pillory and the flames are coming up. And she doesn't give up. She speaks to Jesus at the pillory.
Even though she misunderstood.
Even though she misunderstood.
Which is the important point of your book as well. We are just out of time. So much to talk about in this wonderful book, A Still Small Voice, Father Benedict Groeschel by Ignatius Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Check it out. Check us out next time right here on Bookmark.